The days turned into months, and the months into years, and Emily found herself waking each morning with a mixture of excitement and fear that tingled through her body like electricity running through her veins. She had learned to trust her instincts, to follow the small nudges that told her when to take a risk and when to pause, and she remembered every sleepless night, every tear, every doubt that had threatened to pull her back into the darkness, and she held those memories close, not as scars, but as proof that she had survived, that she had endured, that she had refused to give up. And with each passing day, her business grew larger and more complex. Orders came in from across the country, partnerships were offered that she had once thought impossible, and she felt the weight of responsibility pressing on her shoulders, knowing that she was not just building a business, but a legacy that could inspire others. And she remembered the first time she signed a contract that represented 6 figures and how her hands had trembled as she held the pen. And she thought of the woman who had once believed she was powerless and invisible. And she smiled, knowing that woman was still inside her, but she had been transformed into someone fierce, unstoppable, and determined. And the media began to take notice, and interviews were requested, and she felt nervous stepping into the spotlight, sharing her story on camera, her voice steady but her heart pounding as she recounted the journey from fear to freedom, from silence to empowerment. And she saw in the eyes of viewers a recognition, a spark that reminded her that her story was bigger than herself, that it had the power to ignite courage in others. And she remembered one afternoon sitting in her office looking at a graph that showed her revenue had crossed $1 million, and the tears came unbidden, because it was more than money. It was proof that she had rewritten her destiny, that she had taken control of her life in a way that once seemed impossible. And she thought of every woman who had been told she was not enough, who had been silenced, who had been trapped. And she whispered a promise that she would use her voice to lift them, that she would show them the path that she had carved through courage, persistence, and relentless belief in herself. And she began mentoring other women, helping them start their own ventures, sharing not just business advice, but the emotional tools to overcome fear and self-doubt. She remembered every time she had felt small and powerless, and she used those memories to fuel her guidance, to encourage others to rise above circumstances that tried to define them. And she organized events where survivors of abuse could gather to share their stories, and she felt the energy in the room vibrating with unspoken understanding, with shared pain, with collective courage. And she realized that in lifting others, she was also healing herself, that every story she heard, every triumph she witnessed, reflected the strength she had discovered in herself. And she remembered the first time a woman she had mentored sent her a message saying she had left a controlling relationship and started her own business, and how her heart swelled with pride and relief, knowing that she had played a part in helping someone else reclaim their life. And she thought of the nights when she had cried alone, when fear had seemed insurmountable, and she realized that those moments were the foundation of everything she had built, that the darkness had forged her resilience, that the pain had sharpened her determination, and that without those experiences, she would not have discovered the depth of her own courage. And she began traveling to speak at conferences, sharing her journey in front of hundreds of people, feeling the pulse of energy in the room as listeners hung on her words, absorbing every lesson, every struggle, every victory. And she felt a connection that transcended geography and culture. And she realized that her story was universal, that courage and resilience were languages understood by all, that every woman who had felt trapped could find a way out, that every human being who had faced fear could discover strength within themselves. And she remembered walking into the first luxury boutique that carried her products, seeing the displays and the excitement on customers' faces. And she thought about the little woman who had stepped out into the night with nothing, and she whispered a quiet affirmation of gratitude for the life she had fought so hard to create. And she smiled because freedom was no longer a dream, it was a reality. It was a life lived fully, without apology, without fear, without constraint. And she remembered the quiet moments when she would sit by her window at night, looking at the city lights, reflecting on how far she had come, and she felt a sense of peace that filled her chest like a gentle wave washing over her, knowing that the courage she had found inside herself would always carry her through any challenge that might come. And she began imagining new projects, new collaborations, new ways to expand her brand and help more women to find their voices. And she realized that ambition was no longer something that scared her, it was something that energized her, something that reminded her limitless potential she carried within. And she spoke openly about her story on podcasts, on social media platforms, in magazines, sharing not just the surface victories, but the inner transformation, the emotional battles that had forged her into someone capable of leading and inspiring. And she saw the ripple effect her story had on people, reaching lives she could not have imagined, touching hearts that were ready to hear that courage was contagious, that resilience was possible. And she remembered the first time she was recognized with an award for entrepreneurship, and she felt a mixture of pride and humility, knowing that the recognition was not just for the products she had built, but for the journey she had taken, the growth she had endured, the example she had set for countless women who might otherwise have stayed silent. And she thought about every night she had spent wondering if she could make it, and she smiled because she had made it. And more than that, she had become a beacon for others. And she began planning a book, her words flowing freely onto paper, recounting the path from darkness to light, from fear to power, from silence to voice. And she imagined the day when someone reading her story would feel the same surge of hope, the same validation, the same understanding that they were not alone, and that the life they dreamed of was within reach. And she remembered the first time she walked into her old neighborhood, feeling a sense of triumph and release, because she had returned not as the scared woman who had fled, but as someone transformed, someone whose life was unshakable, someone whose courage had created a reality far beyond what she had dared to imagine. And she thought about the road ahead, the new challenges, the new dreams, and she embraced it with open arms, knowing that she had learned the most valuable lesson of all, that the power to change your life lives within you, that fear can be faced, that pain can be transformed, and that the woman who had once felt invisible could rise to light and shine brighter than she had ever believed possible. And she whispered to herself one final affirmation that would carry her forward forever. I am strong. I am free. I am unstoppable. And she smiled, knowing that those words were no longer a mantra, but a truth she lived every day. She sat in her office, looking out over the city as the sun began to set, painting the sky with colors she had once thought she would never see for herself. And she reflected on the journey that had brought her here, the nights filled with fear, the mornings filled with tears, the long days of struggle, and the moments when she had doubted herself. And she realized that every step, every challenge, every tear had led her to this moment, to the life she had fought so hard to create. And she thought about the little girl she once was, the woman who had felt trapped and powerless, and she whispered to her own soul a promise that she had kept, that she had shown her that courage could triumph over fear, that strength could rise from despair. And she remembered the women who had reached out to her, telling her stories of survival, of new beginnings, of hope. And she felt their presence around her, a chorus of voices that carried her forward and reminded her that her story was never hers alone, that it belonged to every woman who had felt small, every person who had been silenced, every soul who had been told they were not enough. And she felt a warmth in her chest, a fire that could never be extinguished because it was fueled by all those lives she had touched and all those hearts nights she had inspired, and she realized that freedom was not just a moment, it was a lifetime. It was the accumulation of choices made in courage. It was the persistence to rise after every fall. It was the determination to claim a life that was rightfully hers. And she thought about the empire she had built, not just in business, but in spirit, in community, in the hearts of people who believed in her story. And she knew that the true value of what she had created was not measured in dollars or recognition, but in the lives she had changed, in the hope she had sparked, in the courage she had ignited in others. And she thought about the nights when she had felt alone, the nights when the darkness had seemed endless, and she realized that those moments were sacred, that they had shaped her, forged her, and reminded her that resilience was born in the quiet battles that no one else could see. And she smiled because she had survived, she had thrived, she had transformed the pain into purpose and the fear into fire. And she began to dream again with a renewed vision, a vision that stretched beyond herself, beyond her company, beyond the city that had watched her grow. She imagined programs to teach other women to lead, to inspire, to create, to claim their own destinies. And she felt a thrill that made her pulse quicken, knowing that the work she was doing would ripple through generations, leaving a legacy of courage, strength, and hope that would outlive her. And she remembered the first time she had stepped into that dark night with nothing but a small bag and the determination to be free. And she marveled at the distance she had traveled, the person she had become, and she whispered a quiet thank you to herself for every step, for every choice, for every brave heartbeat that had carried her through. And she realized that she was not just telling a story, she was living it, she was embodying it, she was showing the world what it meant to rise from the ashes of fear. And she thought about the women who were still trapped in shadows, who had not yet found their spark, and she sent them her courage, in her mind, in her heart, hoping that somehow her story would reach them and whisper to them that they could escape, that they could build, that they could rise. And she felt a deep sense of fulfillment, knowing that her life had purpose, that her suffering had meaning, that her journey could be a lighthouse for those lost at sea. And she looked at the skyline, now lit with the glow of 1,000 lights, each window a story, each life a universe, and she realized that she was part of something much bigger, that her courage had not only freed her, but had contributed to a tide of change that would ripple across lives and generations. And she felt a peace she had never known, a serenity that came from knowing that she had finally become who she was always meant to be. A woman unbroken, unstoppable, radiant. And she whispered to herself one last affirmation for the night, for her soul, for the world. I am free. I am strong. I am enough. And she smiled because the words were no longer wishes, no longer dreams, no longer mantras, but truths that she lived every day. And she leaned back in her chair, closing her eyes, breathing deeply, feeling the weight of the past lift, the power of the present fill her, and the promise of the future beckon. And she knew that the story was not over. It would never be over. It would continue in the lives she touched, in the courage she inspired, in the hope she gave, in the legacy she built. And she allowed herself to simply be, to exist, to feel, to revel in the quiet triumph that comes not from applause or recognition, but from the knowledge that you have walked through fire and emerged whole, that you have taken every fragment of fear, every shard of doubt, every wound of the past, and turned them into a life of purpose and love and freedom. And as the night embraced the city, as the stars blinked awake, as the world carried on outside, she sat there with a heart full of gratitude and eyes full of tears. And she knew with absolute certainty that she had lived fully, she had lived bravely, she had lived the story she was always meant to tell. And in that moment, she felt infinite.